I'm one of those people that when you ask them to name their favorite of some kind of media, whether that's a movie, a book, whatever, I have this crippling anxiety over what exactly to say. When the topic comes to anime, that's pretty much the same as well, but I do typically sway toward Baccano. Baccano has always ranked among my favorite anime shows, constantly changing position between Ancient Magus' Bride and Cowboy Bebop, and whatever the most recent show I've been watching is. I admit these are very different anime from one another. For Cowboy Bebop, the animation and story mixed with an incomparable soundtrack to create a masterpiece of complex human emotion mixed with violence and love and jazz. The Ancient Magus' Bride takes all my love of mythology and folklore and gives it a new life in one of the most visually beautiful shows I've ever seen. Baccano stands out from these two in its soundtrack being kind of similar to Cowboy Bebop in its use of jazz, but isn't quite as well composed or embedded into the plot. Its characters are not nearly as complex or as deep as either Ancient Magus' Bride or Cowboy Bebop. So why does it capture the imagination of so many people as well as myself? The interesting thing about Baccano is its use of storytelling as an art itself. Baccano utilizes nonlinear storytelling to tell a complicated tale of a huge array of characters. While the characters are incredibly simplistic, the simplicity is part of the necessary exploration of storytelling in ways innately familiar to the viewer. It calls on simplistic natures of folklore and myth to build archetypes both familiar and special. Today, I'm going to spend some time in the world of Baccano and explaining how the nonlinear storytelling of the show works to connect to larger conversations around storytelling and mythology. Baccano is set in the United States, and though it jumps around in time as well as outside of the United States, the primary time period is a Prohibition era with a focus on New York City and Chicago. But as I said, the narrative is constantly shifting time periods, character perspectives, and locations. The shifting views on the same story impacts different people in different ways. The result is a somewhat disjointed narrative, which feels partially purposeful and partially confusing. Different dates get shown on screen, keeping the viewer on their toes, correlating which characters are where at what time. I've seen that this disjointed way of telling stories is a point of criticism for the show. People think it's far more disjointed than structured as purposefully non-linear. This problem is compounded by the sheer number of characters. The cast is made up of at least 20 primary characters, 20, with only groups of them interacting at different points in time. The various names and associations become difficult to track, especially as these relations shift over time, though this means that the associations shift back and forth because there isn't linearity to demonstrate the typical ways characters' relations shift. We're constantly being taken backwards and forwards depending on what time we're seeing and which is relevant. But there is a method to the madness. The nonlinearity, as well as the sheer number of characters, is prepped for the viewer from the very beginning. The story starts the audience at the Daily Days, an organization which fronts as a newspaper while actually working as an information gathering network. We start with Carol, a young girl who sat on a pile of papers on a table, sorting through all the information regarding the incident on the Flying Pussyfoot, a transcontinental train. The conversation starts with a questioning of, naturally, where to start. Carol throws out a date, which she chooses as where to all begin. She's questioned, however, by the vice president of the Daily Days. What follows is a complicated exchange discussing the nature of stories and characters.
What are you doing up there anyway?
Well, honestly, sir, I was thinking about this story.
Story?
Well, I just can't seem to stop thinking about the series of strange events that began back in November of 1930, sir.
What we report is neither unaffected information nor perceived information. It's the precursor to a conclusion. Tell me, you could have chosen any date on the timeline, but you selected 1930 as the point these stories began. Why? How can one not have the answers to these questions and call themselves the assistant to Gustave Saint-Germain, the vice president of the Daily Days? Perhaps you'd like some help.
At this point, the vice president throws out two potential starting points. 1711, aboard the Advena Avis, a ship crossing the Atlantic. 1931, the Flying Pussyfoot, the transcontinental train. He questions Carol about why she picked November of 1930, with all of the information given and the other potential starting points.
Well, Mr. Vice President, I was thinking about how to make the story easy to understand, and I thought, well, the easiest way to see this is through our eyes, so I picked the time when the whole mess was first brought to our attention. Smart, huh?
156 points.
Ugh, out of how many?
While that's the easiest way to see this mosaic, you should think about more than time. The characters are crucial elements as well. Do not neglect to consider them.
The two then consider several characters, and the audience gets their first glimpse of several primary characters that we'll spend the rest of the show getting to know in greater detail. At the end of this, the Vice President gives an important piece of advice to Carol.
Still, Carol, depending upon which of these interesting characters you focus, the same incident will behave like the surface of the ocean. Changeless yet ever-changing. In other words, there may be but one event, but as many stories as there are people to tell them.
This opening exchange is one of the most important scenes in the entire show because it explains everything about how the show is structured and understood. Every character has their own view on the events that unfolded, and every event impacts a multitude of characters the initiators may not even recognize. We as individuals like to think of life as a story that we are our own main character of. Because of this, we may think of events as ultimately impacting ourselves, when, in reality, every action and every decision impacts everybody near us, near the event, and near others at the event. Life is a ripple effect that draws in far more characters than we would have ever considered. Each of these characters have their own way of understanding and structuring their stories. They are a different main character with a different way of organizing the events they experienced. As storytellers, Carol and the Daily Day's Vice President must choose which view to tell the story of particular events, and we as the audience experience the story of Baccano through the different ways that each view changes the perspectives on the story. But as I said earlier, the characters we view the events from are very archetypal, and there's an important reason for this. Baccano's story jumping through time and location also means that there's a variety of characters for the audience to keep track of. These characters can be roughly broken down into 9 categories. 1, the Daily Days, which has several characters throughout the show gathering information or helping individual characters. There are also the main crime families, including 2, the Gandor family, 3, Genoard family, 4, Jacuzzi's gang, 5, the Martillo family, and 6, the Russo family. There's also the ever-changing group of 7, the Immortals, which at times includes individuals from these other groups and at times does not. 8, Huey Laforet, one of these original Immortals and his followers. And finally, 9, the ragtag collection of random other characters who somehow find themselves entangled, such as Isaac and Mira. I list all of these out not to be super pedantic about explaining each character's role, but rather to illustrate the sheer number of characters at play. Not all of these characters survive through the events of the show, but they all play a part, both small and large. Each of these characters are very basic in their construction. They're simple and easy to grasp the base of. Jacuzzi is a strong tactician, but whose big heart brings people close to him despite his constant anxiety. Isaac and Mira are the types of people in their own worlds, unaware of what is around them. These are characters we easily recognize and probably can think of similar characters in other pieces of media. But simplicity should not be mistaken for lack of thought and something that is then discardable. Baccano's characters call back to traditional storytelling in myths and folklore, where characters are simple but meaningful. Characters in these more traditional stories are not simple for no reason. They are present in order to serve a particular purpose. Carl Jung viewed myths and folklore as being universal stories. They weren't impacted by different cultural or social backings, but rather were easily applied across these boundaries due to the collective human unconscious. He saw the simple characters as falling into what he called archetypes, preset understandings of role, actions, and goals that the character enact in the narrative. Some Jungian archetypes are roles such as the hero or the trickster. Each name denotes not only the type of character they are, but also how they can relate to the other characters in the story. The child, for example, is not always necessarily a child, but can be childlike. Their primary role in the story is that of innocence. Essentially, this means that the archetype of the child allows us to not only know who they are as a character, but also how they fit into the role of the narrative more largely. While Jung's views on myth and folklore isn't exactly my favorite, I do actively disagree with many of his underlying views, but his in-depth look at the role of archetypes can be useful for studying something like Baccano, and in particular to understand how simple characters can still be intricate in their own right. Each of the characters in Baccano can be understood as archetypes. Maybe not as perfect the archetypes laid out by Jung, but as archetypes more generally. For instance, Eve Genoard is a good example of the archetype of the child. She has a pure innocence in simply wanting the best for her brother, despite her brother's rough actions toward both her and his own life. Despite the threat of many violent characters in the mafia surrounding her, she continues to act with a bravery that seems only to come from a position of naivety and privilege in expecting the best of those around her. The character's archetypal nature also helps to allow multiple characters to shape the narrative not only in their interaction, but also in their relationship to one another. Lad Russo is a great foil to the other hitman of the story, Claire Stanfield. Where Lad kills ruthlessly and for the fun of it, Claire picks his targets with precision and with an understanding of a value to what he's taking or leaving. These are great contrasting points to one another. The character's archetypal nature means that the narrative can flow between characters in complex ways, allowing the complexity of the character to be within their placement of narrative and their relationship in the narrative, rather than relying on deep complexity of psychology and inner thought. It's often a fallacy in narratives to think of complexity in character needing to be these fleshed out self-understanding ideas. Simple characters are not necessarily not complex. They are just simple to understand and relate to. But we should talk about perhaps the most complex and disjointed character in Baccano. One of my favorite memes is the role of New York as the other character in Sex and the City, not because it's inherently stupid, but because it's inherently true. Even though I've never really watched Sex and the City, I understand the idea of inherently deep, complex growth not necessarily being tied to a human character. A similar function is happening in Baccano. So we understand our human, more or less, ensemble cast to be made up of simple but not inferior characterizations of archetypes. These archetypes work in foils to one another, as well as playing off of one another's needs and motivations to create a complex functionality of interrelationships, which leads to strange events. These events only happen due to the relationships between these characters and the way they interact. The understanding of these events can also change depending on whose eyes we're viewing the event through. Despite the vast array of characters, we don't follow one in particular as the main character, or even have a solid individual who is the singular antagonist. In fact, sometimes protagonists in one view can be active agents working against another character, shifting roles to antagonist when the shift in view happens. These complex ways to understand the roles of characters and events is what leads the narrative of Baccano to essentially require the simple archetypal character presented. But that's not to say that there's no such thing as a character that's not complex in the way that we've come to understand character complexity. The complexity in character is in their relationships, their flow between events, and the way they interact in growing complications and entanglements. All of this leads to the most truly detailed character of the show, the story itself. And this is where the non-linearity of the narrative really shines. Without it, the story would appear to be just as archetypal as the characters, and individuals would flow out of interest just as quickly as they come in. The non-linearity of the narrative requires us to actively pay attention to the growing cast and the ways in which they interact. Essentially, the nonlinearity of the narrative's presentation, paired with the growing cast of archetypal characters, means that the focus for the audience remains only on the story itself. The most intricate and disjointed character in Baccano is not any of the human or immortal characters encountered, but rather the story. The intricate, interweaving nature of how characters interact and therefore impact the world around them. The story is the primary character the audience needs to give their utmost attention to. Traditional storytelling and old myths work actually kind of similarly. The characters in mythology and folklore are not meant to be massively in-depth characters with detailed complexity. They are meant to be easily understood because they carry with them the importance of a narrative, the story of a place, a people's history and ideology, rather than their own individual journeys as a person. Similarly, a larger mythology may be possible to put into chronological order, but this is not necessarily how they are shared and experienced. The different tales are told out of order and presented when it seems important for the audience to experience them. One of the reasons why Baccano is so enticing is because it replicates these more traditional types of storytelling. Its types of characters, story structure, and the way it positions the most important things as the way the story is put together positions Baccano into a familiar way of knowing and encountering narratives. It's also a nice reminder that there are as many stories as there are people to tell them.